presence of Yahweh and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Then Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city Enoch after the name of his son. Now Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Methuel, and Methuel was the father of Methuselah, and Methuselah was the father of Lamech. And Lamech took for himself two wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the other Zillah. And Adah gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and have livestock, and his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all those who played the lyre and the pipe. As for Zillah, she also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Give ear to my word. For I have killed a man for striking me, and a boy for wounding me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. Then Adam knew his wife again, and she gave birth to a son, named him Seth. For she said, God has set for me another seed in the place of Abel, for Cain killed him. And to Seth, to him also, a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of Yahweh. One of the things the Bible does for us is it makes very sober and serious our lives. And in that sense, I would just encourage you, if you are not sober and serious about the significance, the importance of your life, then you definitely need not to read the Bible. Your life counts forever. What you do here, indeed, is what God will deal with you about. And here we are able to see that what is happening in the course of human history is a division of all human beings into one of two communities, we could say, into one of two peoples. And there are only two communities. There are only two peoples. One are the communities of transgression and iniquity. The people who are God's enemies, and they will be the objects of his wrath. The other, it is the community of righteousness. It is the community of faith. It is the community indeed that have been blessed with God's unmerited favor. As we go through this important passage, I would want you to ask of yourself today, which community do you belong to? You will be able to see in the responses of Cain, as Yahweh himself directly engages Cain, you will see the marks of the unbeliever. And you will see the kind of culture and community that follows unbelievers. But then you will see the line of God's unmerited mercy in the seed of the woman who is Seth. And there you will see God's unmerited favor that brings about people who call upon the name of the Lord. They believe. Which one are you? Well, first, we can see, and there's sort of maybe three S's that you can remember that will kind of mark us out. How we'll see this passage teach us. You have two sons, you have two seeds, two sins, and you have two seeds. Two sons, two sins, and two seeds. From this, we will see sin's ongoing results as well as God's merciful salvation in Eve's son, Seth. First, let's look at the two sons and how they relate to God after the fall. Here are the two sons of Adam and Eve. Moses begins this chapter in verse 1 by saying, in one sense, not explicitly pointing out, but clearly, how is God relating to Adam and Eve? Mercifully. God indeed promised that death would come when he broke the law, the only law that was given to him in the garden, and Adam broke that law. Death indeed did come, but could God, on the basis of his righteous judgment, end the Adamic race? After Adam's sin in the garden, would it be right and holy of God to execute death immediately in its threefold forms: physical, spiritual, and eternal? Could God do that? Absolutely, God could do it, and it would radiate for all eternity God's righteousness expressed in divine judgment upon sin and sinners. And yet, what do we see God doing to sinful man and woman? God actually gives to them on the basis not of their works, but rather on the basis of God's unmerited favor. That would be grace. God gives to the man, by knowing his wife Eve, a son. God gives life to the womb cursed by God for Eve's sin. God gives to her a son. Now, this enables us, though it's not explicit for us, it enables us to understand after Genesis 3, when indeed the race has been cursed, the world has been cursed, enmity now, in one sense, is mixed into every fabric of the being, against the husband and the wife, and now against the womb and children and the ground to bring forth harvest. We have enmity everywhere, and yet the beginning of Genesis 4, we see God in his mercy giving life to the married man and his wife. For those who understand the Old Testament to be, oh, God is the God of wrath, and the New Testament is God is the God of mercy, I would just want you to think, I have no understanding of what Old Testament you're reading. God, out of the gate in Genesis 4, is only relating to Adam and Eve on the basis of his grace, not on the basis of what they have merited in their sin. And what Moses tells us that Eve said is significant for understanding this passage. There are divided views on this, and I am persuaded that the way the Legacy Standard Bible, as well as the English Standard Version, the way that they translate Eve's statement here, rightly understands what Eve is saying, but the distinction between the two views is substantial. I read verse 1 this way. Eve said, I have gotten a man with, and you see in italics in the Legacy Standard Version, the help of Yahweh. Now, Yahweh is not in italics, it's in the text. The covenant God of Israel is the one that Eve says, with his help, I have begotten a man. Now, it all hinges upon what is the intention of the prepositional phrase that is used here, so that I think this translation is capturing what Eve is saying. It is this expression of her faith in God giving to her this son. She is recognizing that it is Yahweh who is being gracious to her and has begotten to her this life. The other interpretation of that preposition is that it is a display of her arrogance towards God, and she is boasting in herself that she has gotten a man. I don't think that's the right interpretation. I think here, and even after the fall in Genesis chapter 4, we now see that there is faith in fallen man. That Eve is expressing it is God that has enabled her to have begotten this man. And he is Cain. Now, at this point, we do have to reckon with some cultural distinctions that will become very significant as we continue to go through the book of Genesis. And that is the common convention of mankind, and it continued for thousands of years is that you had your hopes hinging upon the firstborn son. And in that sense, when you would look to the future, if you were going to see something that would make your future bright and you had a reason to have hope in the future, then you would be looking to your firstborn son. I think we are taught, if we would set Cain in the larger context of that conventional wisdom of ancient Near Eastern culture, that we would see Eve is also, she's having some hope in this firstborn son. Not only because of ancient Near Eastern custom, but also because of what God promised that we read in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that the one who would crush the serpent's head, from where does he come? From woman. So I think also this is not only Eve's expression of faith in God giving to her the life of this man, this also is Eve's expression of her hope resting in God's promise that there is going to come from woman the one who will crush the enemy of God's people, the serpent. I think that's what verse 1 of chapter 4 is presenting to us straight out of the gate. So we as readers of Genesis 4, what are we now hoping in? God's promise is going to be fulfilled, for Cain is born. And in verse 2, we meet the other son, Cain's brother, Abel. Now, really, not much is said about Abel in that first sentence in verse 2. The only hint might be what his name can mean. Abel can mean fleeting or vain. And indeed, the fact that he is named Abel indicates what will become true about his life. It seems as if it was in vain, it was fleeting. It may also be that we are taught to understand Abel in relationship to his older brother. For that is the marker in the first sentence of verse 2, that the second son of Eve, Abel, is Cain's brother. Now, in one sense, we will go forward and we can even imagine that when God does explicitly reveal to the covenant nation of Israel through Moses, the mediator at Sinai, he gives to Moses 10 words. And they come to him in one sense in 2 tablets. And so it often is, we call them the 2 tables of the law. And Jesus himself was able to summarize that you can take those 2 tables of the law, those 10 words, and you can summarize them in 2 different relationships. Love God and love your brother. Here we are able to understand these 2 sons. Now for the first time, we have 2 brothers who walk the earth. Will they love God? And will they love one another? Here we are going to see the ongoing, continuing results that are immediate in the Adamic race. Fallen, sinful human beings do not love God and they do not love their brother. The only way that there can be a change is if God, on the basis of his grace, chooses to do that which sinful man cannot do. And so with the first 2 verses, we are able to meet these 2 sons. But now we are able to see in verse 3, they now are going to relate to God, their maker. They're going to come to God in worship. Verse 3 uses a particular phrase. It might be lost on us, but you see the phrase "in the course of time." This is going to be a substantial phrase that will be used later on throughout the Torah, that could even be translated like "and in the latter days," indicating that there was a period of time where Abel and Cain knew that you were going to bring to God your offering. You were going to, in that sense, take from your period, it seems, of a harvest, your life that you had been living, and you were going to present to God that which would honor God. You would bring, in that sense, that which represents your life and your disposition to God, and you would present it to him. It is appointed. Therefore, we are able to know, just with that phrase, Cain and Abel were instructed by, yes, their fallen father, but they were instructed that their life exists for the worship of Yahweh. They do not have an understanding that somehow their life exists for themselves. They were instructed, no, there will be an appointed time, sons, when you will go before Yahweh and you will present to Yahweh your offerings. They are taught to understand themselves in the same way that Adam came to know himself before the fall. He exists for the glory of God. His life is for the worship of God. And so in verse 3, it happened in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to Yahweh from the fruit of the ground. Verse 4 then takes us over to the second brother, Abel. He also brought from the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions an offering. Now, the word offering here is used in Leviticus 2. It is used there where it could be a grain offering. And so while some commentators and preachers would say, well, what fundamentally is different about the offering is the contents that they brought before the Lord. And I do not think that that is a sound interpretation of the two, because you could bring in the Mosaic understanding of worship, you could bring to God a grain offering, or you could bring to God an offering that would come from the flocks. And so both potentially could be accepted. And the word here for offering is applied to both. And it is an acceptable offering that is intended by this word offering. The distinction is not in the contents that they offer to God. Rather, what Moses teaches us, and he does this subtly, but I think clearly, what the distinction is the worshiper, the condition of the heart of the one who brings the offering, in contrast to just the contents that were offered. So these two sons, clearly executing dominion on the earth in two different realms, Cain from the ground, Abel from the flock, and they bring their offering to the Lord. And notice the way that Moses renders the man and his offering. First comes the man, then comes the offering. See, and the way that God judges each offering is on the basis of the man. If you look at what Moses writes in the second part of verse 4, Yahweh had regard for Abel and for his offering. Note the distinction between the man, the offerer, and the offering. God regarded Abel and therefore regarded his offering. But then when you look at verse 5, you see, but for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. Thus, we are able to see from these two sons who have two different dominions in creation, who bring to God on the basis of his grace that which would be deserving to God. They do not approach God in worship with the same disposition. The problem is not what they offer. The problem is the condition of their heart toward God in worship. That's why God regards Abel's offering, but does not regard Cain's. Indeed, you may recall from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, explicitly we are told that Abel made his offering in faith, in belief, in trust. Not so with Cain, because these two sons, though both are in that sense externally coming before God and giving to God what indeed is his due, worship, which is also their duty. They are to live their life before the face of God and for his glory. Yet they are doing two totally different things. Abel is coming to God with a disposition of trust, belief, faith, and Cain is coming before God in disbelief or unbelief, in resentment to God, no delight in God, but in one sense, a begrudging duty to God. And so their heart is the fundamental difference between the two sons. But notice this. How are we able to distinguish the fundamental difference between these two sons? How are we able to find out that indeed Cain, the firstborn, is actually the unbeliever? And how are we to find out that Abel, the second-born son, is actually the one who believes? It is in their worship. It is how they relate to God. It is in their relationship with God that we are able to learn. It is manifest in the actual inward condition that distinguishes these two sons. I want you to understand something. Externally, we human beings, we men and women, boys and girls, may be unable to make the right distinctions between one another. God does not have a problem. He is able to distinguish perfectly between all of us. Are we like Cain or are we like Abel? And though to many of us it could imagine, in one sense, if you were to walk up and offer up to Yahweh your sacrifice of praise, it could externally look exactly the same as the other who comes and offers up their sacrifice of praise. But God is not deceived, because God sees the heart, the condition of the worshiper, and what it is they have in relationship to God as they give or supposedly give to him what is his due. Do not mock God when you come to him in worship. He is not deceived. Hypocrites, indeed, to our eyes, can be difficult to distinguish from true believers, but God does not have a problem in making that distinguishing mark. And it is in worship of God that we see these two sons divide. But God, from the very outset, had regard for Abel and his offering, and did not regard Cain and his. We now move to what hinges at the end of verse 5, and it will carry us through verse 15. Now we see two sins. We move from the two sons, and now we will see the two sins of the firstborn. These two sins indeed will bring about Abel's death and Cain's exile. Verse 5 has the second sentence. We see Cain's response to Yahweh's disregard or rejection of his offering. Cain responds by becoming, notice what Moses tells us, very angry. And his countenance fell. Now, this is one of the things that parents who have younger children, this is something that you just need to thank God for, that your children have yet not developed a sophisticated, sinister ability to hide the countenance from the actual inclination of the heart. And so immediately with our young children, when something happens to them, and thus you do not receive whatever it is that they give, or you have corrected them for wrong that they have done, and immediately their countenance displays externally of what actually internally is operating in the heart. Cain does exactly this before Yahweh, because Yahweh will not receive his offering. Cain is angry. This is the first sin. Cain is angry, but notice, to whom is Cain angry? Cain is angry primarily with God. I think we'll see that this anger, in one sense, as all sins are, there's like a matrix. Sins are like spider webs, they're always intermingled with one another. So that to find one sin and you begin to pull on it is going to sort of pull on another sin. And here we're able to see that the transgression that is called here very angry, and his countenance fell, is going to be because Abel and his offering was regarded and Cain's wasn't. See, that's envy. And verse 6, Yahweh responds. Again, what do we see God doing? The same thing we see God. What did God do with sinful Adam? He pursued him. He went after him. He engaged him in questions, not because God needed answers to his questions, but so that he might engage the creature that he made in his image, that has an intellect and a will, and that he can now draw out of his heart. And we will see very, very clearly what is in Cain's heart from Yahweh's pursuit and interrogation of Cain for his anger. I would stop and also ask, how do you respond when God, through his people, maybe even sometimes directly through his word, but please do not restrict it through your Bible reading or through just sermons, but include in this exercise your parents, your Christian friends. How do you respond when you are not only allowed to clearly be seen as a sinner, you're angry and your countenance fell, but someone then asks you a question? Why are you angry? Are you offended? Do you think they're being unloving to you because they're asking a question that is going to get at why are you driven to respond in this transgressive way? Yahweh does exactly this to Cain. When other people imitate God's good ways and ask us, why do you sin? If you respond like Cain, do not be confused about what you are doing. You are only increasing to your transgression. Why are you angry, we read Yahweh say to Cain in verse 6. And why has your countenance fallen? I'm sure, parents, it happens in our household all the time. Why are you making that facial expression? You're thinking like, I'm glad I'm not in your household. I just want you to be able to reckon something here that we learn that indeed is painfully true about us, is it not? Your life, my life, and Cain's life is lived before the face of God. And God is not going to be in any way ceasing at his interrogation of us because we don't like our hearts to actually be addressed as driving the external expressions that show up in our lives. God will ask, not because he needs the answer, but because he will expose the actual reasons. Why do we have the facial expressions that we do? Because of our hearts. But we also are able to see, what kind of God is this? He is a gracious shepherding God who goes after sinful man. And he asks this question, and notice this is crazy. Look at verse 7. If you do well. Meaning, Yahweh is saying to Cain, look, it's not lost. Just because I did not regard your offering, because you came to me with an unbelieving disposition, that doesn't mean that doing well is lost for you, Cain. Yahweh is still graciously holding out that there is a corrective path that Cain can take. And then Yahweh gives it to him. Yahweh's word to Cain in verse 7 is the corrective path that if Cain would take it, he can do well even after his offering was not regarded. If you do well, if you do not do well, sin is lying at the door and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Stop there. Now, Yahweh reveals something to us that is incredibly sober. It is sober for us to consider how sin works in us. See, the effects of Adam's sin in the Adamic race, that is, what's true of Cain is true of you, is true of me. That if you don't think about sin in the way that the doctors think about Hannah's leukemia, then you do not understand sin. See, some people don't understand cancer. And I'll talk in a way that's pretty plain because I had cancer. Some people think that they can act as if there's some kind of like armchair oncologist and they can give advice to people about what kind of treatment they need to be able to deal with the disease that is cancer, that is not like a laceration. A laceration, a single cut that may be made into a single place that maybe you need to clean it up, stitch it up, but it's not going to spread because it's not happening at the cellular level in such a way that it will not metastasize and, in that sense, consume the life of the host. See, that's what cancer is. You can't deal with it in one place and think that you've gotten it. You have to find where it is in every single aspect of the human body and kill it all of those places. And if you do not kill it there, it will come back and it will kill you. So I'll tell you this, don't ever, under my watch, tell somebody with cancer that they need to go drink a bunch of orange juice and be healed. Because you don't understand cancer. But that's just a sober point to make a point about sin. Sin is not something that we can deal with in one location and think we're fine. See, if we do not rule over sin, sin will rule over us. And so the way in which we want to patch up sin in one area of our life and not deal with the real root of sin, which is our fallen human hearts, is we're trying to treat cancer like we treat a laceration, stitch it up, clean it up, and move on. No. God has to do such a radical work in us that it required his son and the new covenant to transform our hearts such that he would have to give it a title like this: you must be born again. Cain is told by Yahweh, if you do not master sin, sin will master you. That's true for us. We have to be able to recognize I and you cannot keep and nourish sin in one area of my life and think somehow that it is not going to come and consume me. You play with sin like oncologists treat cancer. All of it must die. How does Cain respond? Cain responds in verse 8 by immediately going out and executing the second sin. The first sin is called here angry. Anger out of envy. And now in verse 8, the second sin, we are able to see here that now Cain, as sin deceitfully continues to work, Cain baits Abel, his brother, and to the field. Why into the field? Well, that's where Cain's domain is. That would be, everybody would, in that sense, not be working in the field. That was Cain's area. Abel comes out, and so Cain, seemingly outside of the gaze of man, now rises up and kills his brother Abel. Now, here we are able to see in the second sin the relationship between the two sins. See, the first sin was in the heart, manifest in the countenance, which God himself exposed as anger. The second sin is actually the the operation of the first sin of anger in the heart that now strikes his brother in wrath. See, Jesus talks this way when he talks about anger in the heart and murder. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 19, Jesus said, "For out of the heart comes evil thoughts," and get what's next? Murder. Where does murder come from, Jesus? The heart. I thought it came through blunt instruments or through weapons or through, no, it comes out of the heart. Jesus also said, Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 and 22, you've heard it said, of those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. So Jesus says that if you are angry with your brother, what are you judged to have done? To have murdered. Romans chapter 1 and verse 29, talking about those who indeed had no access to the word of God and to the people of God, yet they were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy. What do you think is next in the list? Murder. Not an accident. James chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and you do not have, so you murder. See, the two sins that we see Cain executing are linked, because the murder of Abel is just the operation of the anger in Cain's heart. Here we learn something that the Apostle John also teaches us in 1 John chapter 3, verse 12. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. See, Cain's murder is the matrix of sinful operations in Cain's heart. Jealousy and anger were the transgressions within the heart of Cain that then were executed in the external operations that we call murder. And what does this illustrate? This illustrates what it is to be a sinner. This is the nature now of fallen mankind. This is all the results of the corruption that has come to man because of original sin. And therefore, we ought not be surprised when God now engages Cain, who is, in one sense, an intensified transgressor. And God, like he engaged the transgressor Adam, he engages Adam's son, this intensified sinner. And he says in verse 10, what have you done? Again, not because God needs answers, because questions from God expose the heart. And how does Cain respond? Exactly like his father, but actually it's degrees worse. He excuses, in one sense, personal responsibility, that he is responsible before God for what he has done to his brother, in the way that he says, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Now, number one, we're able to see that he's trying to shift the attention that he doesn't have the responsibility to be his brother's keeper. But he also just lies to God's face. I don't know what happened. Now, this is exactly what our children do. They're not taught this. We don't have classes about how to become a sinister sinner. And yet, this is the equipment by which they are able to engage in transgression, their responsibility before God for what they do in relationship to others. See, out of these two sins, we find that Cain continues to repeat the same disposition that fallen man has towards God, and that is we excuse our sin, even to the place that we can lie about it to God's face. Fallen man is capable of being absolutely self-deceived. I mean, this is remarkable. Yahweh himself has engaged Cain personally, not only first warning him about mastering sin or sin will master you, but then personally confronting Cain after his sin, and to Yahweh's face, so to speak, Cain lies to him and then shifts the blame. Every single one of us have done the same thing. This is the operation of being an unbeliever. This is how unbelievers relate to God. This is how unbelievers relate to God's word, both his correction and his promises. This is how unbelievers relate to one another. This is how unbelievers relate even to their own consciences that bear witness to the truth. Cain, in that sense, is the first unbeliever, and he is the type that all other unbelievers will follow. And God is not deceived. How does God respond to Cain after Cain lies to God's face and then tries to project his responsibility to not be his own? Verse 10, God now tells him, to me, the way that it's rendered is interesting. To me is what God is saying here. After he says, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. See, sinners think that somehow by not confessing their sin, not being honest about their transgressions before God, somehow they're not liable to God's judgment. That is not the way it works at all. See, the all-seeing eye of God sees all transgression, and evil done in this world comes directly to God, and God executes judgment for it. You cannot erase from the eye of God the transgressions that you have done. God does not need Cain to admit his sin for God to be able to curse Cain for his sin. And so in verse 11, God does curses Cain. See, we saw in Adam the curse of the ground. Now we see in Cain the curse of Cain. Cursed are you from the ground. This curse now falls upon Cain himself, which has consequences about his relationship to the earth and to the land. Cain, as you remember, had dominion over the field, and thus from it he offered this sacrifice to Yahweh. Now God has cursed him in that very same place, so that Cain no longer will be able to bring anything from the ground, but rather must be a vagabond and a wanderer, an exile. And this literally is what took place from God. Notice the direction banishment for sin continues to move humanity east of Eden. Cain is further separated from the presence of God. He's further alienated from the people of God. There is separation from God's people, from God's place, from God's presence. That is what sin does to us. Please note that sin separates us from God, from his presence, from his people. We sin and do not think that you cannot be further removed from God from where you are. Oh, you can be. And the greatest ultimate eschatological separation from God is what we call hell. And hell is just a continuation of God's ultimate and then infinite separation of mankind from the presence of God because of man's sin. Well, Cain is now, by another degree, further separated from God, from his family, and it is all because of his sin. But here, the rest of the chapter, verses 16 through 26, we see two communities, or we could say two seeds, are now planted and emerge in the world. I have to go a bit fast, and these will be sweeping observations. There's a lot of incredible details in the way in which Moses constructed the remaining portion. But first, there is an extended attention to the community of Cain's seed. We meet individuals, starting in verse 16, as we see Cain went east of Eden to the land of Nod, and we see that indeed God, is he still being gracious to Cain? Yes. He knows his wife, she conceives, and she gives birth to Enoch. We then see they make a city. We then go forward and see that God is giving more sons to Cain's seed. And eventually we meet Lamech. Lamech is the first one that we're told who he did not have just one wife, but two. But he actually, we see that from his seed, they develop culture, don't they? We're told that indeed these are the ones who live in tents and have livestock. And we see that one learned to play the lyre and the pipe. We then are told that it is of the other son that come the work of bronze and iron. All of this is indicating, did God, in the division of these two seeds, the first one Cain, did culture and community emerge from the transgressor? Yes, it did. This is what we need to understand from Scripture. You cannot imagine that there are like culture is neutral. That which man does and that which man creates and that which man uses things in this present world, though indeed it's all because God is continuing to sustain life, but you cannot imagine that culture is just neutral. We here are able to see, no, Cain from his seed is creating culture, and they use it for transgression. What is the little, we'll say it's a hymn of transgression that Lamech sings to his two wives. And in that sense, we are able to see at verse 24, what was the curse that would come to Cain? What is the curse that would come to the one who would kill Cain? Yahweh would inflict a punishment sevenfold upon them. Well, what does Lamech boast in his hymn of transgression? Lamech 77-fold. In one sense, Lamech is singing this hymn of transgression. I have perfected sin. Isn't that what a great deal of the music of modern American people? What are they singing about? What are they boasting in? See, they cultures emerge on the basis of the condition of their hearts toward God. And here we are able to see, because of Cain, from this seed, we see emerging in the world a community, a people, a culture that is transgressive. And great attention and detail is given to explaining and portraying that which comes from Cain. And then the last two verses, we briefly meet another community. We meet another seed. And here we see in verse 25 that, again, the projection into the future from verses 16 through 24 is what Moses enables us to understand to be from the seed of Cain. And then he goes back and takes us to the third son. In one sense, the son who becomes the substitute for the slain son Abel. Adam knew his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. because she said, God has set for me another seed in the place of Abel, for Cain killed him. The use of the word seed here is not an accident, but rather connects us to the promise of Genesis 3:15. Here is the line of hope. Here is the one that we are looking to, and we now are expecting to see how will God keep his promise. It will be from Seth that there will come eventually a seed of woman who will crush the serpent's head. And from this one, we see in verse 26 that Seth was given a son. And it's from there that we're told that men began to call upon the name of Yahweh. See, there's now two communities in the world. There is the believing and there is the unbelieving. There is the seed, the community, the culture of transgression, that of Cain. And then there is the seed, there is the community, there's the culture that is from the believing, that is Seth. This is God's work in the world. This is not new work. It didn't start with Jesus. It didn't even start with Moses. It didn't even start with Abraham. It started with the first two sons of Adam and Eve, and then the third son, Seth. See, the question for us as those who know that Jesus ultimately is that promised seed is, which community do you belong to? Are you like Cain and his seed? Or have you come to be of the line of Seth? Have you become a son of Abraham who has believed the good news of Jesus Christ, that last Adam, who indeed was condemned for us for our sins so that we might live forever with God? Christian, we are a part of the believing community. We are a part of those who approach God with faith in his promise. We are those who indeed know Jesus is the serpent crusher, and he has brought us back to God. In one sense, we are just waiting for him to return, and we will enter in one sense to a new Eden, no longer cast to the east, but brought back home into the very place where God's presence will be among us, and we will enjoy his blessing forever. Well, if questions come to you from anything that I've said, come and talk to me afterwards. Love the opportunity to clarify.